We're on Daf Nun Amid Beis, almost finishing the Daf. We're going to count up 7 lines before the end of the Daf, Tanur Rabbanan. And we're going to speak about a topic that we began yesterday, and that is the writers of Stam and the motivation of the Chachamim that these people who go into that profession of scribe should not make too much of a profit. Before we start, I'd like to go back to something that we saw earlier on Daf Nunam and Aleph. And we spoke about, if you recall, people who are not involved in Malacha during the week, and likewise, they're not involved in Malacha on Erev Shabbos Samach L'Mincha, and yet they will be rewarded for that. And the Gemara derives from this the principle of Mitoch Shelo Lishma Bo Lishma. Now, Tosfos points out that there seems to be a contradiction between the statement here in our sugya, which is attributed to Rava, and Rava's statement recorded in Brachos on Daf Yud Zayin, where he says that Ha'osek b'Torah shelo lishma noach lo shelo nivra. He would be better off had he not been born. Tosfos asks a similar question in Sota. How do we reconcile these two comments of Rava? On the one hand, Rava seems to encourage the Olam Yasok Adam b'Torah u'b'mitzvahs shemitoch shelo lishma bo lishma. On the other hand, Noach lo shelo nivra. And Tosfos answers that the Gemara in Brachos is speaking about one case of shelo lishma, and our Gemara about a different case of shelo lishma. And Tosfos differentiates between two fundamentally different categories of shelo lishma. In one case, he's lacking a l'shem mitzvah. He doesn't have the positive lishma l'shem mitzvah. In another, he has a kavana ra'ah. He has a negative kavana. And for example, if someone is just lazy and doesn't get involved in malacha, that's called a shelo lishma, because the abstention from malacha was not l'shem mitzvah, but there's nothing negative about it. The Gemara in Brachos, on the other hand, is talking about a case of someone who learns Torah al manas lihis yaher, which means that he wants to boast about the Torah that he knows, ulekanter, or he wants to use that Torah knowledge to undermine the Chachamim, lekapech es chavero, or to try to defeat his friend, his colleague, in divrei halacha. That's a negative kavan. Tosfos in Brachos has a similar answer. He says that in our case of shelo lishma, we're talking about a person who has in mind al manas sheyichabduhu. He wants the glory and the honor that accrues to a Torah scholar. The Gemara in Brachos, Noach lo shelo nivra, is addressing a case of al manas lekanter, as we said before. However, if a person, according to Tosfos in Brachos, would have the kavanah that he wants to boast about his learning and get extra covered, that's not a negative kavanah per se, and therefore we would encourage him to continue in his learning and mitoch shelo lishma bo lishma. The Shach in Yoredeya, in Hilchas Talmud Torah, in Siman Reish Mem Vav, writes that there is a difference between Tosfos here in Masechet Pesachim and the parallel Tosfos in Brachos, even though we didn't notice any difference. He says the following, that according to Tosfos here, shelo lishma means he doesn't have a kavana ra'ah, and therefore mitoch applies, even in the absence of a kavana tova, but he doesn't have a negative kavana. However, the Shach interprets that according to our Tosfos, is if his kavana was lihis yaher, to make himself into this great person, that would be in fact a negative kavana. Tosfos in Brachos, on the other hand, when he gives an example of Shalol Lishma Mitoch, he's talking about Al Manashi Yichabduhu, he sees that as a lower level, a Shalol Lishma, but not a negative level. It's not like the case of Al Manas Lakanta, which is Noach Lo Shalom Nivra. So that according to the Shach, the difference between the two Tosusim here and in Brachos is the case of Al Manas Lihis Yaheh. Tosus here would see that as a negative kavon, and therefore Tosus here defines Shalol Lishma as a case of Atzlus, someone who's lazy. Whereas Tosus in Brachos would clearly indicate that Al Manas Yichabduhu is not a negative kavana. We would apply mito. I'd like to share with you a summary of one of the insights of the Brisker Rav. And it appears in the Chidushei Agrizim Sota. He says, Maduak sha'os al manas lekanter. Why does Tosas completely exclude someone who learns Torah in order to fight against or undermine the Chachamim or his colleagues, as if to say that's not Talmud Torah, that's not worth anything. If at all, it's a negative. At the end of the day, says the Brisker Rav, even if he studies for that motivation, al manas lekanter, he is still learning Torah. And why is that not a mitzvah of Talmud Torah? Furthermore, he says, how does Tosas know to conclude that al manas lekanter is not included in Torah, it's not Talmud Torah, when the Gemara says that noach lo shelo nivra? The Gemara says that there's something negative about it, but the Gemara doesn't go as far as to say that he wasn't Makayim the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. That far the Gemara doesn't go. And therefore, if we could be medayik from the Gemara, then in fact, even in the case of Al Manas Lekanter, he does fulfill the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and he's obligated to continue learning Torah even at that level because of his obligation, his mitzvah of Talmud Torah. So how can you tell him not to learn Torah? So the Brisker Rav says the following, that Tosas never says explicitly that Al Manas Lekanter is not Talmud Torah. Tosas was bothered. Why does the Gemara say Noach Lo Shelo Nivra? Perhaps he could come to the level of Torah Lishma, and then it would be a good thing that he was born. Noach Livra. Why does the Gemara flat out, this was Tosas' problem, say Noach Lo Shelo Nivra? Why not assume that from the level of Shelo Lishma, he'll come to the level of Lishma? And Tosas' answer is the following, that Me'ikar Adin Kol Alomet Shelo Lishma Noach Lo Shelo Nivra. Any type of Shelo Lishma would be considered and classified as Noach Lo Shelo Nivra. Why? Because he's not really doing what he has to do. But you know what? We assume that even though it's a Noach Lo Shelo Nivra situation, but Mitoch Shelo Lishma Ba Lishma, he will come to the level of Lishma. And therefore, if we could categorize his Talmud Torah as Mitoch Shelo Lishma Ba Lishma, and we anticipate, we hope that he'll come to the level of Lishma, then we're not going to apply to such a person the category of Noach Lo Shelo Nivra, because in the hope that he'll come to do Lishma, he will justify his existence, so to speak, and it would be Noach Lo Shelo Nivra. Why? Because Limud Zeh Yavi'u Libei Limud Lishma. V'lo Al Manas Lekanter, says Tosas, such a limud is not going to bring him to Libei Lishma, and therefore Noach Lo Shelo Nivra. So again, fundamentally, any Shelo Lishma would be classified as Noach Lo Shelo Nivra. However, the reason we don't do so is because in a case of Lomed Shelo Lishma, we assume that Mitoch Shelo Lishma Ba Lishma, and therefore justify his existence and Noach Lo Nivra. The exception to that rule is going to be the case of Lomed Al Manas Lekanter. His essence, his categorization is such that we don't believe he'll ever come to the level of Lishma, and therefore he remains Noach Lo Shelo Nivra. All right, getting back to our Gemara, Torah Rabban. Kosvei Sfarim Tefillin Mezuzas Hein v'sagarehen, v'sagare sagarehen, v'chala oskim b'meleches shamayim. The Gemara is going to explain what that means. It's coming obviously to include something else. Lasuye mochrei tcheles, those who are out there making a business selling tcheles for tzitzis. Einam roim siman brachliol. Because, as we said before, if they get too wealthy, then the fear is they'll stop and retire young, and there will be no svarim to be bought. There will be no tcheles available in the shul. But v'im oskim lishma, here's what the Bryce is adding. In other words, they are interested in the mitzvah, making sure that people have access to what they need to fulfill the mitzvahs, that they'll have stam, they'll have tzitzis. Then roim sim bracha, they will see a siman bracha. There's no need to pray for them that they won't get rich, because these are the people who, even if they get wealthy, they will not retire. Their motivation is to supply Klal Yisrael with whatever they need. Now, you may recall that we asked a question about Tagarehen. We understand that we want to keep the Kosvei Stam, the scribes themselves, we want to keep them working and not retiring young. But what about the Tagarim, the middleman who's buying Sfarim from the scribes, selling it at a profit? Why should they not see a Siman Bracha? What's the big deal if they get rich? He assumes that it's not such a terrible tircha that you wouldn't want to wake up in the morning and be a tagar and buy and sell. Even after you get wealthy, you'll continue in that work. It's not like a scribe who puts in so much work. He can't wait to get to the day that he can retire and support his family with a good retirement plan. So this question is raised by the Ben Yoyod, and he answers that Tagarim are Tagarim that are holchim me'ayaras meruchakos k'dei limchar stam. They supply the outlying areas that are far away from the big cities with Sifrei Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzah, because those people don't have access to the Sfarim stores that are selling Sifrei Torah here locally. And they desperately need to buy Sifrei Torah. So the Tagarim will exert themselves and go all the way out, take a boat ride, and sell it far away. But if they get wealthy, the Tagarim are not going to be interested in putting themselves out and going through all the tirch of traveling far away in order to sell and in order to supply those people who are far away with Sifrei Torah. Okay. Now, the following sugya is based on a Gemara, a Bryce actually, a Masechet Shabbos Daf Yutes. And the Bryce requires that when a person embarks on a journey at sea, he's got to begin at least a minimum of 3 days before Shabbos. Now, from the city of Tsar to the city of Sidon, all the way in the north, is a short boat ride. And therefore, even on Erev Shabbos itself, you're allowed to go from one city to the other because they are so proximate one to the other. The Gemara now tells us a story about the Bnei Baishan. They came from a city that's very close to Tsar, and they were machmir upon themselves not to take a boat ride on Erev Shabbos from Tsar to Sidon, even though, according to the strict letter of the law, you would be allowed to do so. Now, even though the first generation were knowing this minhag l'chumra, the next generation was wondering, are they compelled to follow the minhag of their fathers? So Bnei Baishan, in the first generation, nagu delol havya ozlin mitzar letzida b'mayli shabbos. They would not take this trip from the city of Tsar to that of Sidon on Erev Shabbos. Again, this was at some loss financially to them because Friday in Sidon was the Yom HaShuk. That was the market day. They gave up on the market day. They were machmer upon themselves not to go there because that would interfere with their hachana, their preparations for Shabbos. Also, Benayu, in the next generation, the children came. Kavi de Rabbi Yochanan, Amar lo avasa efshalu. Our father was rich. Anan lo efshalu. We can't miss out on that Friday with a market, a tremendous international market in Sidon, which would allow us to make a profit that we can support our families. Are we committed to follow the chumrah of our fathers? Amar lahu kvar kiblu avosechem alechem. Your fathers have accepted upon themselves this behavior, this stricture, not to go on Erev Shabbos to Tzidon. And when they were makabel on themselves, they were makabel on their children as well. And therefore, you are obligated and committed to observe this minhag. Why? Shenemar Shma b'ni Musar Avicha, Pasuk in Mishlei, v'altitosh Torah simecha, and you are committed to the Musar of Avicha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Torah to Moshe, both Torah Shebechsav, Torah Shebal Peh, and this Torah belongs to the entire nation. Imcha means Amcha, the Ummah. And the Pasuk is telling Klal Yisrael, Knesset Yisrael, that the words of the Chachamim and the Sofrim were Asus Yag La Torah, and therefore, if this was a Siag, then Shma B'ni Musar Avicha, you have to observe the Siag because your parents, when they accepted upon this minhag, this chumrah, they were within the right, they were following the halacha, and the strict law is Asu Siag La Torah. Now the Meiri explains that Torah Simecha is an allusion to minhagim, and the Meiri bases himself on Yerushalmi that interprets the pasuk in Mishlei Al Tavos Ki Zikna Ki Zkena Yimecha is a reference to minhagim, and we have an obligation to fulfill the minhag of our forefathers, because when they accepted upon themselves this minhag, they did so not only for themselves, but also for their children after them. And that becomes what's called, in the case of Bnei Ha'ir Baishan, a Kabbalas Harab. Now, the Pri Chadash in Or Chaim Siman Tov Tzadivav says that the Kabbalah of a father, in and of itself, would not obligate the child who did not accept upon himself that minhag, that chumrah. However, if there's a Kabbalas Harabim, it's not just one father, but the entire community of fathers, right, accepted upon themselves this chumrah, that is going to be passed on to the next generation, even without a Kabbalah, even if they would reject that minhag. If it's only Kabbalas Aviv, okay, they didn't accept it, the tzibur didn't accept it, the children didn't accept it, lo mechuyim b'minhag. But since this minhag, says the Pri Chadash, was a minhag of the entire tzibur, that generates a machayev on the next generation. And all this is really an introduction to our sugya for today. We're going to learn about minhagim. After all, what could be more appropriate than learning about minhagim in a chapter called Makom Shenagu? And we're going to talk about, on the bottom here of Daf Nunav and Beis, the mitzvah of Hafrashas Challah. And the challah was a dough made of one of the 5 species of grains. And rice is not one of the 5 species of grains. What about a city that took upon themselves the mitzvah of Hafrashas Challah even from a dough made of rice? And that actually happened of the Bnei Chozai, the members of the city of Chozai. Nagu de mafrishe challah me'aroza. They took upon themselves a chumrah and a custom to be mafrish challah even from a dough made of rice, what we would call rice bread. Asu v'amru leila Rav Yosef, and they revealed to Rav Yosef this minhag. Amar le, Amar lahu, he said to them, Nichla zar ba'peiv. Let a zar come and eat your chal, meaning it's meaningless. He wanted to teach them in a very dramatic way not to be mafresh from a rice dough. And when challah is given to a kohen, it's also to zarim and has the same status as truma. And in fact, it's a very severe isur if a zar eats truma. But this is not truma. This is not challah. This hafrasha does not have a chal shem challah because it's made of rice. Rice is not one of the 5 species of grains. Now, the shita here of Tosfos is that even though they accepted upon themselves this chumrah, they themselves probably were very aware of the ikar adin that they're not chayiv and challah. But nevertheless, amongst the members of the city, there were those who didn't know the halacha. They were mistakenly thinking that isas orez is chayeves and challah, meikar adin. And therefore, Rav Yosef wanted to make sure that those who were making such a mistake would be proven wrong. To demonstrate that they're wrong, would invite a non-Kohen to eat from this truma, from this challah. So those who mistakenly think that there's a chiyuv to be mafresh challah from isas orez will see that that's not so. So the Gemara, Abaye is upset. If the people of Chozoi were under the mistaken impression that they're obligated in hafrashas challah from an isas orez, then we're not allowed to permit it for them. Because dvarim amutarim v'acherim nagu ben isur, something that according to the strict letter of the law is mutter, but there are those who treat it as if it was asur. On the top of Daf Nun Aleph, Iyata Rashoy La Tiron Bifneim. You're not allowed to tell them it's mutter. They mistakenly think it's asur. You're not allowed to be matter. Why? We don't know why. The Gemara is going to have to give us some insight. But this is the principle that Dvarim Shacherim Noagim Bahem Isur Iyata Rashoy La Tiron Bifneim. So therefore, Abaye turns to Rabbi Yosef and says, in the light of this principle, why did you rule to them that they should invite a non-Kohen to eat this challah? Omar lo, so Rabbi Yosef returns to Abaye, and he says, V'lav mi itmar Allah. We have an interpretation of that principle of Rav Chisda interprets that principle. Rav Chisda bekuzoi, that this principle only applies to the kusim, but not to anyone else. Keep in mind, before we get into the details about who the kusim were, that the kusim were on a very low level. And if you start permitting to them what they think is asur because of their ignorance, they're not going to know the difference. They're going to think that this is mutter and this is mutter. They're going to draw many different conclusions. And therefore, we have to avoid being matter b'fneim, what they think is us. Who are the kusim? So on this, we have a little bit of debate as to the status of the kusim. Let me read to you a little bit of the history behind the kusim. The Kusim were a pagan people who were brought to Ashur, to Assyria, by the Assyrians to Eretz Yisrael. And in Malachim Beis, the Tanakh tells us that subsequently they converted to Judaism. However, the legitimacy of their conversion was a matter of dispute throughout the Tanoic period. Ayin Kiddushin, Ayin Hayamid Beis. In the early Amoraic period, this dispute was resolved, and the conclusion was that they are not to be considered Jews. And that's the Gemara in Chulin Daf Vav. Now, our Brisa predates that final resolution and treats them, in fact, as Jews, but as a group, they were so lax in the observance of Judaism that it requires special laws to prevent a total back breakdown, in their observance. Hence, argues Rav Yosef, I was not bound by the rule formulated by this brisa dealing with ordinary Jews of Chozai. I was perfectly justified in ordering a public nullification of their unfounded custom. And the only exception is going to be the Kusayim, because they are lax in their observance, and special laws apply to them. So it means that if we're dealing with average Jews, ordinary Jews, they have knowledge of the Torah, they're not Kusiyim, then we're allowed to be Noeg Heter in their presence, even though they are Noeg Isa. And therefore, says Rav Yosef, I was justified to be ruling publicly to nullify this minhag. Amar lo, right? And my timer, why is Kusim in a special category? Mishum de masriche milsa, which means that if we'll matter things that they think are asur, then they'll continue to be matir other things. They'll come to be lax and be mezalzel, even in something that's asur, may ikar adin, according to the strict letter of the law. So we can't risk being matir to the kusim that which they think is us. But the bnei mechuzai, inshi nami, those people of bnei mechuzai, they are not Talmidei Chachamim. Meaning, I understand, Rav Yosef, that if you assume that the people who are Noeg Isur should know better, you can go ahead and nullify their minhag. But that's not true for the Bnei Chuzai. These people were ignorant. They didn't know the law. They weren't Talmidei Chachamim. And the same logic that applies to the Kusayim should apply to the Chuzayim. The Sarchei Milsa. They're going to be makil on things which are prohibited mikra din. Perhaps even in a dough that's made of the 5 species of grains, they will fail to be mafresh challah, because you're telling them that if it's made of orez, they're not chayim and challah. They'll think, you know what? Even if it's made of wheat or barley or oats, I'm not chayim and challah. We're back to our question and the objection of Abai against Rav Yosef. Why did Rav Yosef matir the Isas Orez to the Bnei Chozoi? Therefore, the Gemara says, Ela Omer of Ashi, Chazinon. We're going to investigate. I Ruban, if most of the Bnei Chozoi, Orez Achli, they eat from a dough of rice, and they would not eat from a dough of the 5 species of grains, is then lo nelcha zarba payu. Then we will not be matir for zar in their presence to eat from a challah of ores. Why? Dilma mishtakha Torah's challah minay. Because just 1 second. So what was the case now? Ruban ores achli. Right. So dilvish tak. But let's see the next case. The ruban dagan achli. They will eat from a dough made of grains. They don't eat from a dough made of ores. Is nichla zar be'apai. Dilma asi lafrushe min achiv al aptur. So Rav Ashi sets up the rules and the bounds. When do we revoke their minhag and invite the zar to eat from the truma, from the challah, and when do we not? He says the following. If a majority of the people eat rice bread, and they don't eat grain bread, then we're afraid that if we'll be matir them and invite the zar, as we said, that aren't going to eat from their isas ores, then they'll forget the entire entity, the enterprise of Hafrosh, because that's what they eat. They eat rice bread. There will be no memory of Hafrosh's challah, because you're telling me that even in rice bread, which is our staple, we're not mafresh challah. So as time goes on, they'll forget about the whole entity of challah. However, if they generally eat grain flour, then we're not afraid that they will forget about the whole entity of Hafrosh Challah, because we're not telling them not to be Mafresh Challah. We're only telling them that if they make an Isa out of rice, they should not be, which is unusual, because again, we're talking about a place where they could afford buying dough and bread that's made of grains. So there's no reason to assume that they would forget the entity of Hafrosh Challah. However, on those occasions that they eat, that they make a rice dough, we have a definite motivation to tell them that that's not challah. Why? Because dilmas lafrushim and achiyuv al aptur umin aptur al achiyuv. If they continue in their mistaken impression that even a dough of rice is obligated in challah, which is not true at all, they're going to be mafresh min achiv al aptur min aptur al achiv. When they have, let's say, a dough that's made of rice on this side of the table and another dough that's made of one of the 5 species of grains on the other side table, they'll think it's all the same, and both doughs are chayav in challah, and therefore they'll be mafresh from one onto the other. Such hafrasha is not valid, and therefore they'll be eating tevel, which is a terrible isur. So we cannot be matir. So there are basically 2 elements here in the equation. One is that they are ruban dagan. Most of the dough that they eat in that particular area location is chayav in chal. Therefore, we have no fear that if we tell them that in the unusual event that they have a rice dough, they don't need hafrasha, we're not afraid that tishtakach Torah challah, because they continue being mafresh challah in the dough that's made of the fine grains. But on the other hand, we have to be careful about the possibility that they may continue in the mistaken philosophy that even a rice dough is chayiv and challah. And that's something that we have to knock out of their heads, lest they come to be mafresh min achiv al tur, etc. Ufa farma mutar machim nogu ben isrei tamar shoy latir lifnei Rav Chizda bekusoy askinon. As we said earlier, the reason why we cannot be matir is because Rav Chizda says in the case of kusoyin, they'll start, making analogies and equations, and they'll assume if you are matir this, then we can be matir that. So the Gemara asks on Rav Chizda v'kuli amal lo, but as far as the rank and file Jew is concerned, who's not a kusoy, you're allowed to be matir in their presence what they think is asur. Tanya. Now we're going to study a brisa, and this brisa is going to tell us about 3 different stories that took place in 3 different locations, in which the people in each of these locations took upon themselves a chumrah. Each one is a different chumrah, and the chachamim who visited those locations, and unbeknown to them, they violated that minhag makom because they didn't even know about the existence of the minhag makom. As soon as they found out about it, and people were saying, why are these so-called great scholars violating our law? They immediately jumped out, and terminated that behavior. So we're going to have a discussion, for example, about 2 brothers. Brothers allowed to go into a shower house together. There's nudity there. Are we afraid that they'll have bad hurhurim? And again, strictly according to the letter of the law, it's mutter, but there was a chumrah that was accepted as a custom in a certain place. We'll talk about certain kinds of shoes that are very run down, and the question is, you're allowed to wear them on Shabbos, because if they fall apart, he may inadvertently carry them back into Rosh Hashanah. And we're going to have a discussion about certain areas in the public which were dedicated for marketing, for selling and buying. Are you allowed to be there on Shabbos? Would people suspect you of imitating the goyim and selling and involving yourself in business and commerce on Shabbos? So the Gemara is going to prove that in each one of these 3 stories, the Chachamim were very careful not to be matir publicly in their faces what they took upon themselves as a chum. Hatanya, we have a brisa that says rochatzin l'shnei achim ke'echad. There's no pretense here if 2 brothers happened to be together and they went to a beis hamerchatz where there's nakedness. We're not afraid that anything terrible is going to happen. They're brothers. But nevertheless, there was a place called Kavul, and Ein Rochatzin Shnei Achim Kavul. The people of Kavul took it upon themselves as a minhag to prohibit 2 brothers from taking a bath together. Umaisa b'Yehuda v'Hillel banav shel Rab Gamliel. Imagine, the Nasi Rab Gamliel had 2 sons by the names of Yehuda and Hillel, and they were brothers. They found themselves on one occasion in Kavul, and Rachatzu Shneim Kechad b'Kavul. They weren't aware of the fact that the people of Kavul had taken upon themselves this chumrah that brothers don't go in together into the Beis HaMerchatz. And then as a result, when the word got out in Kavul that these 2 scholars, so to speak, that was their reputation, this Hillel and Yehuda, were taking a bath together, laws aleim b'nei Abedina, the entire district started being motzi laws. These are not religious scholars. Amru, they declared, and this was going around like a clarion call from one house to the other in the city. This was like the Lashon Hara of the day in Kabul. Mi'amenu lo re'inu kach. We've never seen such a thing, that two brothers would go together into the bathhouse. The Nishmat Hill v'yotzel beis hachitza. Immediately, when Shmuel became aware of this minhag and the laws that was going around, he removed himself from the actual room where you went into the merchatz, and he went into the beis hachitzon so that he would be separated from his brother Hillel, from his brother Yehuda. So the Gemara is medayek, v'lo omar lehem, v'lo rotza lomar lehem, mutar matem. Why have you taken upon this chumrah? That there's no halach that requires and enjoins two brothers from going to the Beis HaMerchatz. That Hillel was not willing to say. He did not want to be matir them on that which they took upon themselves as an Isur. And the Brisa continues with story number 2. Yotzim bikur de kisim. These are very, wide kind of shoes. B'Shabbos, you're allowed to wear them in Rosh Hashanah. And we're not afraid that if they fall off, they'll carry them. However, not in a case called Biri. Ein yotzim bikur diskison on Shabbos and Biri. They took upon themselves a chumrah not to wear these shoes in public on Shabbos. Ma'aseh b'Yehuda v'Hillel banav of Gamliel sent in this case the same two giant scholars. Sheyatzu bikur dekison b'Shabbos b'Biri v'laz alehem amedina v'yamru v'yameinu lo re'inu kach. We've never seen Jews who will walk in the public thoroughfare on Shabbos wearing these wide shoes. Ushmatun. Immediately, Yehuda and Hillel removed their shoes. V'nasnum liavdehem. They gave each one respectively his shoes over to the servants, and we're talking about Eved Knani. Another example of dvarim shacherim kiblu alatzmo leisur iatarashoy lahate b'fneim. Third story. Yoshvim al safsalei nachrim b'Shabbos. On Shabbos, you're allowed to sit on those benches, public areas where they do business, and they have special benches that are designated for the business. And we're not afraid that if you sit there on Shabbos, people are going to start spreading rumors that you're selling and buying commodities on Shabbos. However, in Yoshvin al Safsalei Nachrim b'Shabbos b'Akko, in the city of Akko, the people took upon themselves a minhag not to sit on these safsalim, which are designated during the week for the goyim to sit there and do business. Ma'aseh Rav Shimon Gamliel sheyosav al safsalei nachrim b'Shabbos b'Yakov. Unbeknown to him, he was violating their accepted minhag, and he sat on these benches. The laza olav kol medina, and there was an uproar in the entire district. Amru mi'amenu lo re'inu kach. Is immediately Nishbat Rabbi Shimon Gamliel fell off the safsal and v'yoshev al gabi karka, and he sat on the ground. He did not want to teach them that their minhag was really not justified. It was against the Ikar Din, and you're allowed to sit on these benches. But in any event, we see that in all these three cases, Even people who are not kusim, if they're knowing Isur, we're not allowed to be matir, that which we know is not really asur. And that's difficult because Rav Chizda said that this whole din of Iyatar Rashay Latir B'fneim only applies to kusim. In these cities, we're not talking about kusim. The Gemara answers, B'nei Medina Nami came with Lo Shchichi Rabbana Gabayu Kekusim Damu. In other words, you're right. As a general rule, we're not going to be matir a minog of kusim in their presence. But the B'nai Medina, where they don't see and have contact with Talmidei Chachamim who teach them and guide them the laws, they are considered like kusim relative to this halacha. They don't know, they're ignorant. And they think that if you're going to be matir X, whatever it is in the three cases, then we can draw other conclusions and we can be matir other things that are really awesome. So the bottom line is that Rav Chizda, when he said B'nai Kusim, he didn't mean literally the Kusim and only the Kusim exclusively. He meant Kusim and anyone who fits that profile of a Kusi, who's namely Lo Shchichi Rabbana Gabayu. They don't have any sort of regular access to Talmidei Chachamim. And once you're matir something that they know is also, because in their mind it's also, they're going to start making analogies, and before you know it, who knows what they're going to be matir. So this is something that we have to be concerned. So Gemara says the following: Bishlei Masaf Sali Nachrim. I understand why you would accept upon yourself a chumrah not to occupy those benches that are designated during the week for mischar by the akum, because somebody might suspect him of doing business on Shabbos. Could this kisten? I understand that. Nami. Dilma mishtalfin, maybe they'll fall off, they're very loose, they're very large. The asi le'isunayu the arba amas b'shusarab. Maybe these wide shoes will fall off their feet and they'll carry them inadvertently for amas b'shusarab. Ela rochatz in my time alone. Why is it justified? Where is the siyag here in the case of two brothers going into a merchas? Mar assumes there's no chashash isur in such a case. So our answer is Kirisanya. The reason for the isur that was that they accepted upon themselves in the city of Biri. No, where was it? Not Biri. It was Kabul, the city of Kabul. Not that it makes much of a difference to us, even the most sophisticated travel guys probably don't know the difference between these two cities. Anyway, the Gemara says that the Brisa formulates the principle in Makol Adam Rochetz. We allow men to go into a Beis HaMerchatz, chutz mi of. It's not coveted for him to see his father naked. Now, Rashi gives an explanation for this, which throws a slightly different light on this topic. And he says that when a man sees his father's naked body, he might come to have thoughts about how he was created. He might have hirhure aver. And v'chamit. Again, if he sees his wife's father naked, once again, he might be clouded his mind with thoughts about how she came to be, if you know what I mean. So those are hirhure aver. The same applies to Bal Imo, his stepfather, Ubal Achoso, and his brother-in-law. In all these cases, the halacha is concerned that if he sees the nakedness of their bodies, he may start thinking, Hirhure Aver. Rabbi Yehuda Matir bi Aviv, Mikvod Aviv. Let's not play games over here, because in a bathhouse, it could be very dangerous for an older person if chas v'shalom he slips and he falls, breaks a leg. And therefore, the best way of guaranteeing the safety of the father in the Beis HaMerchatz is if his son will join him. V'hu adin l'bal imo will apply the same logic to his stepfather. Because once again, he has to be Mishamesh, his stepfather, when his stepfather is an older gentleman is going to the Beis HaMerchatz. Now that's the end of the Bryce, as far as what is prohibited. So we have the case of Aviv, we have Chamiv, we have Baal Imo, and Baal Achos. Nothing about two brothers. The Asa Inu and these people of the city of Kavel came along. The Gazer, they made Xera B'Shnei Achim. Now, why did they prohibit Shnei Achim for going into the Beis HaMerchatz? Mishum Baal Achoso, meaning once the Xera applied to his brother-in-law, who's married to his sister, then we become aware of the fact that there's a Chashash Hira Vera on that level, meaning it's not your sister, it's the husband of your sister. That's Baal Achoso. And Achiv is like Baal Achoso. It's that same generation. Tana, we learned in the Brisa, Talmid lo yirchatz im Rava. A disciple should not go into the bathhouse with his Rebbe, but the im Rava tzachlo muta. In other words, there should be a certain innate embarrassment when you're standing in front of your Rebbe. And is naked. So this should be avoided. Don't go into a bathhouse with your Rebbe who's naked. However, a Talmud is obligated to care for his Rebbe, service his Rebbe, and in case an event that his Rebbe might fall or need his help, he should be there. And that's called Rabbo Tzarcha. In any event, let's just summarize what we learned from this Bryce. The Bryce is establishing that these Talmidei Chachamim, when they became aware of the self-accepted Isur and Minhagim of those areas respectively, they immediately terminated those activities. The Gemara says, I understand in 2 out of 3 of the cases the logic that, or the suspicion that compelled the people in those various cities to accept upon themselves the Chumrah. In the case of the Safsoli Nachrim, that's when people do business, you'll be suspected. And in the case of those wide shoes, there is ample room to worry that he might lose his shoes and then go back and carry them. And finally, even in the case of Shnei Achim, that's a Xerah to Baal Achos, so shouldn't go into the bathhouse together. Because in all those cases, the Minhag extended a Xerah philosophy. And that Xerah existed on the books in certain cases. So there are many things which Chazal say you're not allowed to wear out in Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos because you might lose them and carry them. And in the case of Safsoli Nachrim, once again, to sort of imitate a situation which is appropriate, which is generally associated with buying and selling, don't create that ambiance by sitting on those benches. And that we can understand. And even in the case of Shneach. But if we go back to the case of a rice dough, there's no chiyuv and trumas and maasros in rice dough. We never found the Rabbanim made any sort of gzeros. So Badomi Liban, they came up with a new parsha of challah, which doesn't exist in the Torah, and it's not a gzera, then we should be objecting. Especially in light of the fact that this chumrah could lead to a terrible takala of minachiyu al ptur. So therefore, says Rav Yosef, in such a case, we're not afraid that if we tell them, forget about hafrashas challah from a rice dough, they'll completely lose sight of the entire enterprise of hafrashas challah. They generally eat regular dough made of the 5 pieces of grains and the hafrashas challah. The only problem is that we can't stand by idly and allow them to continue this minhag because of the danger and the pitfall of minach chiyuv al ptur. Therefore, we have to notify them that there is no chiyuv challah in event that the dough is made of rice. Now, here, in conclusion, we want to mention a machlokas. He says, "V'braisa v'gemara mevuar she'ein chiyuv linog es haminhagim shel osam b'nei Medina ela bekusim or b'nei Medina that are similar to kusim, where it's also to be matter b'fneim. Aval shelo b'fneim mutar linog shelo k'minhagim." Now, this seems to contradict the very principle that underlies our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that if you take a trip from your location and you relocate in a place where they're noig a minhag, you have to follow their minhag. And the answer is that each minhag that obligates is based on some horah of the Talmidei Chachamim. But if the people themselves accept upon themselves a minhag, and especially if that minhag has a certain drawback nature to it, a danger, then in such a case, there is no minhag. The Torah, the halacha, doesn't recognize that minhag as a valid minhag. Again, bifneim might be a problem if they're kusim or the like, because they'll start making equations and analogies. But if it's shelo bifneim, even if you're in their city, and the Mishnah tells us, Kimakom Shaholchu L'sham, you are not obligated and committed to follow that minhag, because that minhag is not based on their rebbeim, it's not based on Talmidei Chachamim. They accepted upon themselves, spontaneous generation of minhag, l'chumrah, very fine and dandy, but that minhag has no status and it cannot obligate. And on the contrary, in some cases, we have to be matir it bifnei. Hey, Rabbi Osai, this is where we're going to stop. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, John, you have to go somewhere now, right? All right, so we'll miss you in the next year, but let me give you a Yashar Koach for the whole week, and if I don't see you, have a great Shabbos. All right? And Jeff, you too. Cult.